Well, so last week the governor introduced the executive budget for the 2015-2016 year. I'll walk through there's a lot of information in here, so I'm just going to go through it line by line, and can certainly share with you a copy of my notes. And then Larry will come up as well and help bring it down to ground level as to what some of this will mean for us. For the first and foremost, the state is running a deficit. They are projecting a deficit for this current year, the 2014-2015 year, of $330 million. In order to offset that, about $102 million will be used through state budget cuts. The remaining amount, though, is coming out of state school aid. So they're going to backfill the state general fund deficit using a good chunk of our state school aid surplus. I believe we're sitting at about $500 million right now, so they're going to use a pretty substantial chunk of that to fill this current year deficit. For the 2015-2016, the total school aid budget is at $15.9 billion. That's just under a 1% increase from last year. Of that, it's broken down $14 billion for public schools, $393 million for community colleges, and $1.5 billion for higher education. You're not looking at anything right there. These are just my notes that I'm looking at. To kind of keep going, that diversion, if you will, is an additional $28 million, or 2% of the operations, for the 15 public universities, an additional $4.3 million, or about 1.4% for community colleges. Part of the recommendation includes it calls on universities to limit their tuition increases to 2.8% or less. Another aspect of the budget, the governor is proposing, and this is one of the better parts of the budget, $108 million increase in the foundation allowance, which is the equivalent of about a $75 per pupil increase. This would bring the minimum foundation allowance up to $7,326 per pupil. And correct me if I'm wrong, Larry, but that's exactly where we would end up.
Exactly.
Yep. And then the basic foundation allowance would be at $8,174. So it's notable that, again, while we're getting a bump, we're still far below the basic foundation, but we are up, from last year. There is a new investment in third grade reading. This is something we anticipated, and there's actually a pretty high level of detail, so I'll go through that. But the idea here is to have a pretty substantial investment, really pre-K through third grade, and that it will be complemented by the legislation that we'll talk about on agenda item number 2. But the $25 million is broken down, and they do not specify in high level of detail how they're going to do it, but there will be a piloting a parent education program which is going to help to educate parents in how to better support their children with their literacy skills, expanding the ISD home visits to at-risk families, bless you, improving early child care services. They'll use a multi-tiered system of supports to improve literacy instruction. So there's an investment in professional development for both new as well as existing teachers. There's actually a new test that they're proposing for the new hires at the elementary level. The teachers would have to pass a literacy skills test. Investing in literacy diagnostic tools and training them how to use it. So looking at how we're going to use the data and interpret it to better inform our instructional practices. There will be an increase in funding for instructional time. There's an acknowledgement that there's going to be a tier of students that, in order to get them to that third grade reading level, that their additional instructional time will be necessary, and there's about $10 million invested in that. $3 million for literacy coaches, another $2.6 million for kindergarten entry assessment. This would be a kindergarten through second grade assessment. Right now, the MEP, or which is now known as M-STEP, doesn't start till third grade, and you have kind of a really a hodgepodge of different assessments from pre-K through second grade. We rely heavily on map testing, so we actually have the data, and you'll see when I talked about the best practices later on, we already have an existing tool that we use that can help inform our instructional practices. But this funding is intended to bring more uniformity statewide as to how we're assessing that kindergarten readiness. There will be a new state clearinghouse to kind of identify best practices, what's working, where they're seeing certainly among those at-risk youth and in those maybe higher need, higher poverty schools, if there's certain techniques they're implementing, will be included in this clearinghouse for other districts and other schools to use. They also put money in for Pathways to Potential, which will provide success coaches targeted at at-risk elementary schools. So those elementary schools with the highest percentage of students who are underperforming or are not proficient on third grade reading or K through 2, this Pathways Potential will divert additional what they call success coaches toward those schools. The brightest spot of this budget, I think Larry would agree with me, is our at-risk funding. We have not seen our at-risk funding, our 31A at-risk funding increase since 2002, and they're proposing a 30% increase. It's an increase of $100 million, and Larry may be able to talk more about what that may mean for per pupil, but that's, remember, those are limited though. Those are not unrestricted. These are funds that have to be targeted and used for a certain purpose. There's $25 million for technology infrastructure. This is building on the transition for the online testing for M-STEP, and eventually for the new SAT will be an online assessments, and a lot of districts, including our own, don't have the technology infrastructure to really support this. We can do it. It's more it's going to take a lot more time and energy on the part of the teachers and the administrators in the buildings to get the students into the computer labs and making sure that they take the 20 minutes it takes to boot up the computer and all of that. So there's a pretty substantial investment in career and tech education. The governor's recommending $17.8 million for expanding career and tech education through early middle college programs. There's also an additional $2.2 million to invest and to increase the number of college advisors in schools. They don't specify, but the idea is how do we have more support in that counseling area? So they're creating a program that would put more college advisors. These are in many ways students fresh out of college who would be hired as advisors. They don't specify how that will be divided up or where they're going to target it. $1.75 million for student enrollment in college courses and advanced placement. So again, the dual enrollment is getting an investment. First robotics, which this year we went from basically 2 teams to 10 teams in robotics, and our goal is to double that next year. Our teams received, I think right now we're looking at about $10,000 so far to support the development of those programs. So we do benefit from this first robotics investment. It's statewide. It's pegged at $2 million. With the total new investments, there's over $80 million in college and career readiness investments. Now, getting down to the tail end here, best practices, you might recall we've been receiving that best practices categorical now for a number of years. That has been cut substantially. It was at $50 per pupil. It's now down to $20 per pupil. And they created new categories. So it's split up into both financial and academic categories, which notably, that's got our fingerprint and the ISD's fingerprint all over it. We've talked a lot about how do you look at the 2 different categories. Of the financial, you have to meet 2 of the 3. You have to have a dashboard. That you have to maintain a fund balance of greater than 5%, which we meet both of those, so we already qualify. And the third one I thought you might get a kick out of is that if the fund balance is under 5%, the school board must receive additional training.
It's sunny Florida.
I thought you might like that. And then the academics, you have to meet 2 of the 3. You have to administer a kindergarten assessment for ELA and math.
So paternalistic, unbelievable.
You have to administer tools to monitor reading skills and support professional development on literacy. And you have to have a tool to assess effectiveness of college and career advising according to the Michigan College Action Network standards. and I don't know what that latter one means, but we do meet the first two. So we're already in line to at least receive those. Notably, our performance funding was eliminated as well, and that was another categorical that we received. That was $70 per pupil. So if you take the $30 per pupil cut in best practices and the $70 per pupil cut in performance funding, that's a $100 per pupil cut. So our net, I guess, if you take the $75 per pupil increase that we're getting and the $100 per pupil cut, we're actually looking at a $25 per pupil cut if you don't include the categoricals. Those are unrestricted general fund dollars that we would use as part of our per pupil funding. There's additional funding for distressed districts. This is targeted for those districts that are financially distressed to help them through transition. There's $75 million in that. The MIPSers, they did maintain a high level of investment in MIPSers. That's a total of $1.07 billion. $960 million supports the unfunded liabilities, and the 101.
You guys slow down just a little
Sorry.
bit, just a tad,
Sorry.
just a tad. I'm fast, but what was about the MIPSers?
MIPSers $1.07 billion. Billion with a B. 960 of that is for the unfunded liabilities, and 101 is for to offset normal retirement costs. And Larry can maybe explain what that means. And then lastly, we're going to have to fight again for special ed itinerant. You might recall we have a categorical for special ed itinerant where we typically receive lapsed dollars. It was over $2 million this last year, and that once again the executive budget does not include that categorical. So that's eliminated. We're going to have to go to Senator Hildenbrand, who is the approps chair now. So we've already had a conversation with him. He already knows it's coming, and we feel pretty confident we'll be able to get that restored. But all in all, there's some cautious optimism in here in the sense that where the investments are going are smart, they're strategic by and large. The third grade reading we knew was coming, the college career readiness we knew was coming, a good chunk of which we've been advocating for. Obviously the increase in the at-risk, where we've said we know it's going to take more to move student achievement. We're very encouraged by that. Unfortunately, there's really a net loss when it comes to the unrestricted funding for per pupil, and so we're going to have to spend some time working on that and working on this special ed itinerant funding. Those are going to be our two top priorities, obviously, is how do we ensure that this is not a net loss of $25 per pupil, and how do we ensure that that special ed itinerant was restored? Larry, do you want to? Sorry.
A couple questions?
Yep, yeah, and that's all I have from the budget.
Is that all?
That's it.
So, you have that in report, so we could get that?
I can email this, absolutely.
That'd be fantastic. Okay. And then, also, will this be adjusted significantly depending on what happens in May with the election? Or is this going to
The governor has
remain?
stated that they're going to build a budget that assumes that doesn't pass, and that at that time, if it does pass, they would then they would do amendments to the budget. Would that affect, obviously we're looking at a $200 per pupil increase if that does pass. I don't anticipate that they would, use that to essentially cut from this. I think it would be above and beyond what this budget is proposed, but, that's to be determined. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Just a few things. Good morning, ladies. As John mentioned, the basic foundation allowance is an increase of $75 a student. And one of our concerns in our finance side of the industry for years and years is all these categoricals which we depend upon. And the concern that the legislature can cut them any time. And as John mentioned, they did cut performance funding, which is $70 a student, we've been getting for several years, and then reduce significantly the best practices. The equity payment, which has been around for a number of years, is actually rolled in. I think actually last year was formally rolled into the foundation allowance. So the 25 net decrease in unrestricted funds in this budget equates to about $500,000 less from the state than we got this year. If we get the same 32% increase in the at-risk funds, that will add about $120 per student increase, about $2.1 million. So our net increase could be as high as 1.6 million. Now, as John mentioned, the at-risk dollars are restricted. Fortunately, because of our district demographics, we have all of our buildings get at-risk dollars. In a lot of the programs that we as a district are on the academic side in particular, are supporting, we can use a lot of those at-risk dollars for that. Now, whether there's enough, the ability to spend that $120 per student increase remains to be seen. We also don't know for sure just how exactly that increase will be distributed. We also don't know what particular guidelines may surround those additional dollars. This year, those at-risk dollars were, the state wanted us to focus on third grade reading proficiency and 11th grade career and college preparedness, if you will. Now we have this other pot of third grade dollars, so whether or not the at-risk dollars and the focus changes remains to be seen. They did give us some more this past year, even though third grade and 11th grade readiness were specified. They did give us a lot of flexibility for us to determine what that would look like in actual spending dollars. We did and will continue to spend some of those at-risk dollars for class size reduction because we do know it has an impact on people's ability to learn. The other thing that continues to loom out there, as John mentioned, is the retirement system. It's $24 billion underfunded. They're putting $1 billion into it. 960 odd million is coming right off the top of the school aid fund. So even though it's not out of our foundation allowance, if you will, if we didn't have that massive unfunded liability, there'd be more dollars in the school aid fund to put to the classroom versus into the retirement system. So that continues to be a significant drain on the resources going into the classrooms. So that's it's kind of good and bad, if you will, and we hope that the House and/or Senate would put some additional dollars into the foundation allowance when they come through with their proposals. I will also mention John made this clear, but the community college funding, I believe all of it is coming out of the school aid fund.
That's
this
right.
year, yeah. And there was that anticipation that if the sales tax increase was successful in May, that extra dollars that would come to the school aid fund, there was a lot of speculation because of the hole in the general fund budget. Those extra dollars would actually go to the community college. Well, that's happened in the current budget. So if that sales tax referendum does pass, in fact, hope those additional dollars and will stay with K through 12, since under the current budget,
Is there any
community college is
commitment
fully
or
funded.
statements to that effect?
No.
or-
I think and I think John's going to talk about this in a minute, I think the bigger risk is the thing not passing and what that could mean,
Right.
which is probably not pretty.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So that's all I need to
Question
add.
with just for my own understanding of the history of the school aid fund and the formula that sets it up. How common has it been that they borrow from it? I mean, I know it has happened since I've been on the
They
board.
can't borrow from it.
Or they
Divert.
divert
Yeah,
from it.
there's,
That happened that's a relatively, I'll have to go back to see if it's ever been done prior to the Snyder administration.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if there have been one time, here and there sprinkled, but it's been consistently diversion, and that's a relatively new phenomenon to my understanding. I mean, as long as I can remember, since working here in particular, my recollection is that did not happen until the Snyder administration came in, and they were using it during. Part of it is the school aid fund was stronger than the general fund, and they were looking for means by which to maintain, some level of funding or amidst budget cuts across the board. It wasn't just the schools; it was across the entire state budget.
I guess I don't know. It'd just be curious to see what the per pupil funding would be if the diversion both to the higher ed and to the general budget wasn't there, whether.
That's $1 billion to universities alone.
Right.
I mean, that's a big chunk.
what's also happened as they've diverted some of those dollars into higher education, the the allocation from the general fund into the school aid fund has significantly decreased over the years too. I think this year, well, last several years it's been less than 100 million, less than 50 million. I believe it's $50 million, when 10 years ago was hundreds of millions. So all those, it's turned into a fund that when there's budget holes, it's done the back of K through 12 education, quite frankly.
Notably, if the proposal one, and I know I'll talk about this, but one of the clauses built into that is that the higher ed portion will no longer be accessed through school aid. That would eliminate the higher ed
Except for
diversion.
community college.
Except for community college, yep, just for the 15 public universities. It was part of a Christmas tree that got put together in order to get the votes to get it to pass, to put it on the ballot.
Gretchen
It's-
Whitmer and a few others were in a back room. And
I'll save that for my agenda item 3, but when I read through it, it'll come clear as to all the different bells and whistles that are included on this proposal. The main whistle being roads, and that's something we'll talk a lot about.
But it'll restrict 90% of the school aid fund. If the sales tax increase passes, will have to go to K through 12. Only 10% can go to community colleges, specific to funding scholarships, career readiness programs,
Yep.
and those kinds of things. So that's a good thing.
why don't you just can we jump to that and do the third grade after that, since
Sure.
we're talking about it?
Sure. In your packet, I believe you have this handout, and if you don't, it was in the,
Here, right.
yeah, what was emailed to you.
Yep, got it. Here, I got mine up if you don't have it.
And I'll just walk you through it. So I think we're gonna go through this one pager and just take the time, go kind of line by line. The main, obviously, when they put together this agreement, there were 5 key points that they looked at. The funding for roads and bridges, obviously being priority number 1, but also looking at how do they protect schools, communities, public transit, and rail. How do they ensure that transportation taxes are going for transportation purposes, that they maintain competitive prices at the pump, and provide that tax relief for low-income Michiganders. That's when the leaders in the House and the Senate and Republican and Democrat got together, those are what they put together as their the 5 key things that led to the agreement. In this case, the legislature approved a ballot proposal that'll raise the state sales tax up to 7%. It'll eliminate the sales tax on motor fuels. It'll remove higher ed from the school aid budget, which is what we just referenced, and amend the use tax distribution. The way this ballot proposal would work, if it's approved, is the wholesale tax on motor fuels. That's $1.2 billion for roads and bridges. They're looking at some registration changes. It'll be $95 million in revenue. The other transportation-related reforms, and some of this I have to admit I don't have a high level of detail, but this last one, number 4, it will provide $260 million for the earned income tax credit. And this is a huge benefit for the families that we serve. You might remember this was funding that was eliminated, and you're talking upwards of $1,000 per family if they're for eligible families. And so it's a substantial investment, money for for at-risk, high-needs families. The total revenue generated would be $1.34 billion. The elimination of the sales tax on motor fuels is a loss of $752 million. But the revenue that would be generated, you'll see it breaks it down by transportation is $1.3 billion, 1.2 of which would go to roads, and the remaining largely for transit and rail. The schools, though, would receive $300 million. The local communities, like the city of Grand Rapids, would be looking at $94 million. And then there's that tax relief, which is the earned income tax credit for low-income families at $260 million. So this is something where we would see upwards of a $200 per pupil increase. And then I wish our friends from the city were here, but they would also receive a pretty substantial increase in their funding. So they are strongly supporting this initiative as well. And that's why we've brought to you as we'd like to recommend that the board amend your legislative platform and to support the passage of Proposal 1.
Want to suggest that? Jess, can we do it with just two people
Yep.
here?
Two.
Got quorum.
Yeah. Support, move it forward.
All right, great.
Is there going to be like a third-party
Yes.
effort organization on this?
Yes, there is, and we are, I've already participated on one of the conference calls, so the groups are, at the statewide level, are organizing from the school groups to the local municipal township groups, to the roads and bridge groups. They're all coming together. Dave Waymeyer of Martin Waymeyer is, at least at this point, I believe the lead organizer. Trying to remember, Terry Reed, who ran the governor's campaign, is on the team as well. And there's a couple others. Some of the top politicos in the state are organizing it at the state level. The trick is that we're a little late in the game. Absentee ballots go out in just not too long from now. We're talking about about 4 weeks from when the absentees will go out. So,
Will
and
there
the
be a local effort organized here?
Yep. Yep, the ISD, the Friends of Kent County Schools are organized, and obviously we'll do our informational campaign. That's something that what we can do is communicate with our stakeholders, with our parents as well and staff, as well as the residents of Grand Rapids, sharing information about what happens if it does pass, what happens if it doesn't pass.
All right,
Third grade reading.
third grade reading.
All right, so the legislation, unfortunately, we do not have, the legislation, at least from the version that Representative Price was working on, has not been reintroduced yet. And based on, as of Friday, him talking with Chris Glass and Rusty,
Okay.
I have not been able to locate anything that's been reintroduced.
So what I heard from those folks at the ISD on Friday was not,
That's when you said that, and I tried to find it, I
Yeah.
didn't find it.
okay.
It doesn't mean that maybe that's under a different representative, not under Representative Price. But what we know is that the legislation that will either has been or is soon to be introduced is going to mirror much of what was being done in draft form. So we never did actually see the introduced version of the amended changes, but it's very in line with what your legislative platform is, that there's discussion about the need for clarity among standardized tests to determine whether or not those children are on track to be third grade proficient. So as the governor's budget tells us already, they're putting money into actually developing that assessment, as well as the professional development around the training, the literacy. And so you're starting to see the alignment. I think the legislation will likely mirror that and will include this standardized test. The other aspect about it is we have a new M-STEP, that's the new test. So we've said right from the get-go that this needs to be phased in. If they're going to impose this, whether it has retentions in it or not, that there needs to be really a 3 to 4 year phase-ins to allow the first group of kindergartners that hit the third grade level, that they're being assessed in the same way, that that assessment is aligned with M-STEP, that we are really organizing statewide so that there's uniformity and consistency in knowing what third grade proficiency looks like. Alternative assessments, this was another one we talked about, is that if this child is not proficient based on this new K2 assessment or the M-STEP assessment, they should be given an alternative assessments that they could use to essentially prove that they are third grade reading proficient. The good cause exemptions, this is something we also anticipate will be in the legislation. It was in the draft version that was being proposed for amendment, that would be providing good cause exemptions for students with IEPs and English language learners. Now, what we're hearing is that the governor's office is not supportive of retention. And so where it had landed during lame duck was that only students that were in the fourth quartile of proficiency, so the least proficient of the students, those are the students who could be retained. That was what was based on the legislation, but that, if you took out the different exemptions, if you take out students of special ed, students or ELL, For Grand Rapids, we ran the numbers, we were looking about 50 students who could be under threat of retention. We're hearing that that the governor's office is even less supportive of retention, so we're not sure where that's going to end up. I think where the struggle is how do you maintain enough teeth in it so that there is movement on the numbers, that the school districts and the schools take this very seriously to get the numbers up so that no child is left behind, so that all children are third grade reading proficient to the best of our ability. And so stay tuned. I think we're going to continue to monitor this. We've heard that this is something they want to move early, and we anticipate that we'll be seeing something real soon. I know Rusty has a call into Amanda Price just to kind of get an update, and I have all day in Lansing with Rusty next week, Wednesday. So we're going to spend a whole day, and I know we're meeting with Representative Price as well. And the idea is just to go and do the rounds about the budget mostly, but then also share a couple of our top legislative priorities. Sinking fund, obviously, will be one. Third grade reading. And then the critical shortage is another one, which we're seeing very positive movement in the House. The critical shortage legislation has already moved out of the House committee and is now on the House floor. And we're hearing it's going to move through the House and into the Senate rather quickly. So what's great is a lot of our top legislative priorities appear to be aligned with the top legislative priorities of the governor and the House and the Senate.
John, when you mentioned when you were going through the budget and you were mentioning, it's very heartening to see the budget reflecting a lot of substantial support for good policy for third grade reading. So you mentioned parent education. Is there anything in the budget or the legislation regarding support for attendance efforts?
I'll have to look through to see that. I don't recall seeing anything specifically tied to attendance. The pathways to potential success coaching might have some effect on that. I'll glance through here again. By the way, in what Larry handed out, there's a great summary, which is exactly the one I've used to develop this. It's in the back of this pack.
Okay.
It's the issues papers. This is
Yep.
something that was emailed to you as well.
Yep.
But this is the most comprehensive version of the entire package, and I don't recall seeing anything on attendance specifically. It seems like that would have stuck out to me, but
And what about summer reading, summer literacy?
I don't see it called out specifically. But again, I think a lot of the investments that are looking at interventions, summer reading is part of that intervention. So when it talks about expanded instructional time, literacy coaches, targeting additional assistance, I think those would all include potential summer school of sorts. But no, I don't see anything, as I flip through just quickly, that specifies summer reading, but I'm sure there's portions of it.
If proposed language comes out, send it our way.
I'm sorry?
If something actually comes out, proposed language, if you see
Oh.
something and you send it our way.
Yep, absolutely.
Mm.
So lastly.
Questions about
other
the third grade?
questions?
Okay.
You see so much effort put into trying to make it happen.
Yeah. You know,
Just holding kids back.
yeah.
Totally opposed to.
The other states that have done this, like Florida, have seen dramatic increases in the number of kids that are proficient third grade. So we anticipate the numbers are going to move. We got to make sure the numbers move. You know, we've asked for this, so now it's going to be, now if the investment comes and we're required to do it, we've got to move the numbers. Lastly, and I'm not going to spend as much time on this today, but the joint legislative platform, this is something we've done typically with the city of Grand Rapids. Last year, we did it through the liaison committee, the city school liaison committee. Teresa really thought it most appropriate to actually start at the respective committees, at this legislative committee as well as at the city's legislative committee. The city of Grand Rapids, their legislative committee has already reviewed our platform, and they have come up with suggestions for what parts of your platform they can support. And then they recommended some parts of their platform that they'd like you all to consider. The city of Grand Rapids is closed today because it's holiday, yep. And so they were not able to join us today.
Slackers.
Yeah, right. So, unfortunately, I'm just not as well versed on some of their issues. So what I'd like to propose is that, we can walk through this a little bit here. Let's kind of look at what's listed. And here, I can, do we have an extra packet? Sorry, I forget that you guys, can you pull that up there, Dr. Falb?
Yeah, I got it right here.
Okay, and I'll vocalize it. Under local government, it says to support the implementation of a sustainable city model at the state level, building on the governor's Office of Urban and Metro Initiatives, encourage the state to take a holistic approach to making strategic investments in cities' economic engines, make targeted investments that leverage distinct assets in urban and metropolitan areas to transform regional economies. I don't know a whole lot about what that current investment is through the governor's Office of Urban and Metro Initiatives, but I can say, that initiatives like our Congress Neighborhood School revitalization, that's something that the governor's Office of Urban Affairs has actually taken a specific interest in. So it's something we may end up seeing. What they've asked us when Andy Guy was in that position, said, well, what is it that you could do? I said, well, you know what we need? We need a person to help organize. So, maybe there's some funding for a grassroots organizer who can help, implement the neighborhood school initiative. Or maybe there's data, or there's infrastructure improvement. We talked about, looking at site improvements to parkland, to curb cuts, to transit centers. If there's a bus stop there, how do we align some of those dollars to support that? So this seems like something that would be relatively easy for us to support, not just because it supports the city, but I could actually see how it might benefit us as well.
You probably don't know if there's related to that, just funds to do needs assessment in communities. I mean, that's partly
Yeah.
what's really hard to get at.
Sure. I mean, that's potential, but under transportation, they support updating transportation funding mechanisms, secure sufficient resources to maintain our roads, bridges, and other transportation infrastructure assets, including transit. Your endorsement of Proposal 1 today largely supports that exact issue. Environment and energy support the continued causation-based liability standard under Part 201, and that any updates to Part 201 cleanup criteria are based on reasonable and realistic conditions. I know enough of this to be dangerous. Back when I worked for the chamber, I worked on the environmental issues, and the Part 201 standard is very complex. It's something that it'd be best to have them come in and explain to us, but it's an environmental standard that that some businesses argue is overburdensome, and I think that's what they're starting to get to with this. But again, we'll have to bring the city in to explain more of what that means. Support a comprehensive and fair statewide recycling plan. We are already partnered with the city, where we're with our U.S. Green Building Council Green Fellow. One of her projects is to collect, to ensure that the recycling bins are in all schools. We now have them, a list of each of those bins are coded, so we can actually assess which schools are actually recycling and which ones are not. And so she's using that data to target her efforts to increase recycling from the schools. And so this seems like a pretty simplistic thing for us to support as well. Ensure our region maintains air quality attainment status. Again, this seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Number of our children affected by air quality.
Absolutely. When we talk about, even as we begin to talk about the bond in the future, which you'll hear next Monday, one of the greatest values of that 2004 bond was improving the air quality in our buildings. That was something where you had many of our older facilities, from mold, dust. These are facilities that had outlived their life expectancy and were still being used for teaching and learning, and they weren't the best environments, and we still have a few of those schools that we've got to address. Buchanan is one of those schools that will be the poster child. And if you might recall, the old Henry Padea, that was one that was actually got national media attention because of the mold and some of the other issues that were there. So Under education, these are those that they signed on, and again, this is supporting funding for after-school programming, supporting the School Aid Act rewrite to improve urban education outcomes. This is, as you recall, part of your platform. We talk about the funding formula and how it's really not a formula that's based on the academic needs of students. We know that it costs more based on state and federal mandates to educate children, whether it's at the high school level or the elementary, or it's an English language learner or a special ed student or a general ed student. We know there's different mandates and there's different costs associated with that. So we're nice that they would come alongside us and support us. Support the early childhood funding, support the Our Sinking Fund expansion, support the teacher and school administrators retirement reform. This again speaks to the MIPSers. We know that there's additional reforms needed. The calendar reform that we've talked about, as well as third grade reading. So those are the issues that were a part of your agenda that they saw as something that would align with the city's goals. Under the federal, support the completion of the new international trade crossing and funding for the United States Customs Plaza. This one is not probably quite as overly relevant to us, except for it's one of those issues that is really already been determined. It is going to get built. It's just going to take a lot more time, energy, and lawsuits. If you go to the next page, support the city's ongoing efforts with FEMA for the LAMP process to ensure the best possible outcome for the city. Support the city's request to FEMA to consider the timeline approach to meet FEMA's desired outcomes. I'm not entirely sure what this is. I do believe this is tied to the flood walls. I could be wrong, but I believe that
You're
that's...
on the committee, dear.
I know. Well, the LAMP thing is what throws me off. That doesn't quite catch me as that term, but support the city's ongoing work with the Urban Waters Federal Partnership to create the best and most vibrant urban river in the United States. In some ways, through the museum school, we're kind of running side saddle to this in the sense that there were students that participated in a grant through U.S. Fisheries and Wildlife that looked at how the museum could bring watershed education as part of future exhibits and development at the museum. Our kids, obviously, at the museum school will be hands-on and will benefit directly from that. Support energy funds programs such as energy-efficient block grants to further investments in energy efficiency for public, residential, and commercial buildings. This is similar to some of the work that Healthy Homes Coalition is doing. In fact, I believe they may even get some of this funding from the city for this.
Yeah.
This is a no-brainer. This is one that benefits our families directly.
Related to third grade
Absolutely.
reading. All the lead poisoning.
Support the sustainable investments in communities through community development block grants. This is something that we also are pretty hands-on. The community development block grants largely support the neighborhood associations and other neighborhood-oriented activities. You saw recently an invitation to this neighborhood summit that we are hosting with the city of Grand Rapids, and looking at how do we maintain and increase CDBG funding is one thing, but also how do we better spend it? The old neighborhood association models need to be questioned and tested and looked at. What's being done elsewhere across the nation? What are those best practices? The models certainly can still work, but the level of accountability, the level of results that should be received as a result, and the expectations. We just have to rethink and really push the bar up a little bit at the neighborhood association level. Support surface transportation reauthorization, Federal Highway Trust Fund. This ties directly to our roads. Support responsible, cost-effective solutions to stop and prevent the spread of invasive species in the Great Lakes. Support the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, research and protection. Support stormwater regulations that do not put undue burden on businesses or communities or promote unnecessary sprawl. In some ways, we do a lot of work with West Michigan Environmental Action Council and some of their Teach for the Watershed. So in many ways, this is directly related to the very education that we're bringing in under our science and environmental education. Support the Main Street Fairness Act and close the online sales tax loophole. Items to monitor for joint action. Modifications to downtown development authorities. This is, last year there was
So, Just going back to the sales tax, because that's related to us as well.
Absolutely. If
what do you think politically speaking, are the chances that would happen?
I actually think there's a little bit of traction to that. I think you might see some movement on that.
I mean, if they if they didn't divert funds and May passed and they closed that loophole, we
should
could
be
see a
doing-
huge.
We should see a pretty
influx of cash.
substantial
Yeah.
increase in funding for schools, absolutely. This is one of those where more and more shoppers are going online, and if that company is not honoring the state sales tax, and they're not actually participating and ensuring that revenue and applying that sales tax online, it's a substantial loss of revenue for the state and obviously for the state school aid fund. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I imagine it's probably something that's been quantified that we'll be able to share with you at a future meeting. The last three things there, the DDAs, this is one, there was an effort legislatively to greatly diminish the tax increment finance authorities. And so that's something that the legislation did die, and it's one we're going to keep an eye on. The unfunded mandates and district court investments, they have a lot of unfunded mandates just like we have unfunded mandates, so we have definitely joint interest in monitoring that. And the municipal electric rate class, and I just don't know what that means and what it is that they're looking for there. So something to chew on. Obviously, what I'd like to recommend is that we have Horace Alabasic to come in at the next legislative committee next month, and we'll go through these issues at a higher level. And then you would ask if you support that you make a recommendation to the full board for their approval.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Be great. I guess I should, for public record, I should back up on the third grade reading to mention that at the Literacy Center, we've convened, we have a coalition of literacy providers, and we've written a position paper that aligns with GRPS and Talent Triangle, but it's wonderful because it has a number of people signed on to it, like KSSN and the Grand Rapids Public Library, and the ISD, Grand Rapids Public Schools, number of literacy providers in the area have signed on to support
Good.
the policy, so, yeah, for the public good, yeah.
Can I see it?
Yeah, absolutely, I'll send it over to you,
Great.
yeah.
Yeah, it's nice, and thank you, because that's, the
Yeah.
more we can align our efforts, the
That's
more
good, it's
effective we can be
exciting.
in Lansing. And
So we've
it's-
got to get on it if this is moving, so
Yep.
we got to bring it out there. The other question I had, it came up from our work session, and that is, we've never talked about our, we always talk about the legislative body and the governor, but our relationship to the State Board of Ed, and I'm talking specifically about this screening test that seems to be holding back potential education majors in the colleges, and whether we should take a position on it, examine it. I know there's been talk about another test that's used quite widely nationally that would be more reasonable. I don't know whether we need to look into that and whether we need
Yep.
to approach the State Board of Ed regarding that. I mean, it's impacting us directly, and
Yes, it is.
specifically efforts we're having to grow our own, finding more teachers of color.
We're also learning, so since your work session, we've had conversations with GVSU, and apparently they were already in the process of forming an alternative certification program. So it's something that, as a district, the level of investment, time, and capacity building that would be necessary for us to try to administer it ourselves be very challenging, at least at first glance. And according to our friends at GVSU, our first glance is very right. It's very cumbersome,
Yeah.
and they've struggled, but they're finally on the brink of getting this alternative certification. Sharon and I are meeting with Dr. Collins, Dean Collins, and Professor John Shinsky, who's been spearheading that program, I don't know, in like 2 weeks, I think we're meeting, so.
So is it the State Board of Ed then that would approve an alternative certification process, or who?
I
It's legislation.
Yeah, I'll have to check on that, I'm not really
So
sure.
it might be worth focusing on all those issues that were raised with our critical shortage and what advocacy efforts we need to sort of formalize our position on. And
You know, I would be interested, Dr. Shinsky is an old friend and colleague of mine, and he emailed me that fast.
He called me as well. I lecture every semester at his Masters of Ed class, so, yeah.
real interested in that whole piece that they're working on. I thought I saw a draft of legislation.
I'll have to look.
Got some more work for you to do.
No,
which
and
is
that's
what you need,
why we're
Josh.
here. No, that's good. I mean, we were already following up on that right after your work session. So, I mean, we took that entire conversation to heart and looked to see what we can move on. So, we'll continue that. So, adding to a future agenda would be obviously inviting the city to come. I'll have an update on what the status is with the Michigan School Board on the teacher testing and what, if anything's being talked about either at the school board level or the legislative level, as well as this alternative certification and what, if any, legislation may be out there.
And then if draft legislation comes out on the third grade,
Yeah,
we'll send it our way.
I'm guessing we'll have it by then. But, yeah, we'll bring that. I guess the other part I'll bring is to add more detail to the critical shortage list. It's basically the same legislation that was there before, just without the sunset. So our HR team has reviewed it already. We've signed off. The ISD has had some individuals testifying. So, but we'll put that on there too, because that's right in your wheelhouse of top priorities.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you're going to give us a draft of your notes that you read on the budget.
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
Thanks.
Do one of you want my paper copy right now?
Yeah, get some real stuff done.
You do?
Get some stuff done.